Lachlan looked at my hand as if I were offering him a piece of garbage. The lobby of the Glass and Steel Tower was buzzing with the elite, all tailored suits and expensive perfumes. I stood there in my old waxed hunting jacket, the one that had seen 30 winters and still kept out the cold. I extended my hand, a simple gesture of respect for the anniversary of the firm I had helped build from the shadows. Lachlan didn't take it. He just straightened his silk tie and adjusted his gold-plated cuffs. "Keep your withered hands to yourself, Cyrus," he whispered, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "There are serious people here today, people who actually matter, so try not to embarrass us. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories." He turned his back on me, laughing at a joke made by a man in a $5,000 suit. I didn't flinch, and I didn't pull my hand back quickly like a scolded child. I let it hover there for a second, a silent testament to the manners he had never managed to learn. My wife, Leona, stood beside me, her eyes like cold flint, watching the man she once called family. Lachlan thought the cameras were capturing his moment of ultimate triumph and power. He had no idea they were actually filming the precise moment his empire began to crumble. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for my next move. Lachlan glided away to join a circle of investors, his laughter echoing against the marble floors like fake coins dropping. I stood my ground, wearing my old jacket like a tailored coat, while the tuxedos around me felt as flimsy as paper. A waiter drifted by with a silver tray of things that looked like tiny, expensive mistakes. I took one, a microscopic piece of raw fish on a cracker, and wondered if they charged by the calorie or by the level of pretension. It tasted like ocean water and regret, making me miss the greasy sandwiches Leona and I used to share in the truck when we started this business. At my age, you learn that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. I wasn't anxious because of his insult. I was anxious because I knew exactly how hard the marble floor would feel when he eventually hit it. I checked my watch, a heavy mechanical piece that had never lost a second in 40 years. Precision is a habit, one that Lachlan had clearly traded for a flashy digital screen that told him everything but the truth. Leona leaned in, her voice a low hum of controlled electricity, reminding me that we weren't just guests, we were the foundation. I didn't need a microphone to be heard. I had the silence of a man who knows where every skeleton in this company is buried. He thought I was a relic, a ghost haunting his shiny new future, but ghosts are the only ones who see what's coming in the dark. I watched him lean in to whisper to the lead investor, the man whose first mortgage I had personally guaranteed back when we were both nobody. The trap wasn't set out of spite, but out of the necessity to teach a lesson that a boardroom never could. I saw Serafina, our daughter, approaching with a look of forced apology, and I knew the second blow was coming. Serafina reached us, her face a mask of polished concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dad, maybe you and Mom could move to the lounge area near the back?" she suggested, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She looked at my jacket again, as if the canvas were contagious and might infect the silk drapes. I smiled, the kind of smile I usually save for a dog that's tried to bite its own tail. "The back?" I asked, looking at a digital map on a nearby screen that flickered every time I got close to it. Modern technology has a way of sensing my skepticism. It either freezes or starts playing upbeat jazz I never asked for. I accidentally brushed a sensor, and a holographic display of the company's growth spurted into the air, nearly hitting me in the nose. "I'm just worried the noise is too much for you," she added, though the only noise was the clink of glasses and the sound of egos expanding. It's funny how children eventually start treating their parents like fragile antiques they're afraid will break the decor. I've survived 3 recessions, 2 roof collapses, and a bear encounter in the Cascades. But apparently, a cocktail party is my breaking point. I didn't argue, because arguing is for people who aren't sure of their position. "We're fine right here," Serafina, Leona said, her voice like a velvet hammer, closing the subject. I watched my daughter retreat, her shoulders tense, clearly feeling the weight of the choice she was making. She had forgotten that the very chair Lachlan sat on was paid for by the hands he now deemed too withered to touch. The injustice wasn't the request to move. It was the realization that they had forgotten who built the mountain they were standing on. Lachlan stepped toward the podium, adjusting the microphone with a smug grin, completely unaware that the man he had just insulted held the master key to his entire future. Lachlan tapped the microphone, the sound booming through the hall like a sudden gunshot. He began his speech, painting a picture of a company that had supposedly risen from nothing through his sole vision and modern grit. I decided to find a steady spot to observe, so I tried to lean against a sleek, obsidian pillar near the wall. To my surprise, my elbow went straight through it. The pillar was nothing but a high-definition light projection meant to look like solid stone. I caught my balance instantly, smoothing out my jacket while a young man in a turtleneck looked at me like I was a glitch in his software. Modern times, I muttered to myself, where even the walls are lying to you. On stage, Lachlan was hitting his stride, his voice dripping with the kind of confidence only a man who has never truly lost anything can afford. To succeed, he declared, looking directly into my eyes, one must be willing to cut away the anchors of the past, the sentimental relics that slow us down. The room erupted in polite, wealthy applause, and I felt the air grow cold around me. He wasn't just building a future, he was actively trying to erase the history that I had bled for. I looked down at my hands, scarred from the early days of hauling timber and late nights over blueprints, and felt a strange, quiet clarity. It wasn't anger. Anger is messy and loud. It was the cold calculation of a man who knows exactly which bolt to remove to make the whole machine stop. I saw Vaughn, the lead investor, nodding at Lachlan's words, unaware that he was being sold a house built on sand. My thumb traced the old brass lighter in my pocket, a steady weight in a world of holograms and fake stone. Lachlan signaled for a video presentation to begin, his smile widening as he prepared to claim a victory that wasn't his. The lights dimmed, but my gaze remained fixed on the back of his neck, right where the sweat was starting to bead. The screen flickered to life, showing a timeline of achievements that conveniently started the day I stepped back and let him take the lead. The video presentation was a masterpiece of revisionist history, full of bright colors and fast edits that made my 30 years of labor look like a dusty footnote. I reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, but the glass was so thin and triangular that I spent 3 seconds wondering which corner was actually meant for drinking. I finally took a sip, only to realize it wasn't water, but some sort of infused cucumber essence that tasted like the inside of a lawnmower's collection bag. I choked back a cough, maintaining my composure while Lachlan pointed to a slide titled The New Era, which featured a photo of him standing alone where my old office used to be. He wasn't just ignoring my presence. He was actively burying my legacy while I was still standing right in front of him. A woman in a dress that looked like it was made of recycled tinfoil leaned toward me and asked if I was the maintenance contractor here to check the HVAC. I looked her in the eye and told her I was just checking the structural integrity of the egos in the room, which seemed to be nearing a total collapse. She walked away quickly, probably to find someone who spoke influencer, leaving me to watch my life's work being rebranded as a solo miracle. Lachlan's voice rose, describing how he had purged the old-school inefficiencies to make room for his own genius. The room was filled with people nodding in rhythm, a sea of expensive haircuts agreeing that the past was just heavy baggage. I felt a slight vibration in my pocket, a text from my old foreman, asking why the quarterly equipment lease hadn't been renewed. It was then I realized Lachlan hadn't just been arrogant. He had been dangerously reckless with the company's actual foundation. I didn't need to shout to get attention. I just needed to wait for the moment when the truth became louder than his presentation. Lachlan caught my eye and signaled the cameraman to follow him toward us, clearly intending to use my presence as a punchline for his grand finale. He started walking over with a microphone in hand, his face twisting into a mask of false, public pity that signaled the real humiliation was about to begin. Lachlan stopped 2 feet away, the camera lens practically sniffing my collar like a hungry animal. Every company has its roots, he announced into the microphone, his voice smooth and oily for the benefit of the live stream. And here we have a perfect example of a root that served its purpose but has finally gone dry and brittle. The crowd chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement, and I resisted the urge to check if I had cucumber juice on my chin. Cyrus here taught me everything about the manual labor side of things, he continued, gesturing mockingly at my jacket. I felt a flash of something heavy in my chest, a realization that my daughter's husband was truly willing to burn me as fuel for his own ego. It wasn't a breakdown of my spirit, but a final shattering of any hope that he might possess a shred of hidden decency. I reached into my pocket to check a text from my lawyer, but the font on my phone was so small, it looked like a line of ants having a frantic meeting. I squinted at the screen, and Lachlan took my silence and my struggle with the technology as a sign of my fading faculties. See, he whispered, leaning toward the microphone with a smirk. The lights are on, but the power grid has been decommissioned. I didn't blink or turn away. I simply waited for him to lean in for the final, patronizing pat on the shoulder he had planned. My heart was a steady drum, marking the seconds until his world would tilt and slide into the abyss. He stepped closer, the scent of his expensive, metallic cologne hitting me like a chemical spill. He thought he was delivering a eulogy for my career, but he was actually narrating the final moments of his own empire. Lachlan reached out as if to pat my shoulder for the cameras, his hand hovering like a vulture over what he thought was a carcass. I shifted just an inch, making him miss and stumble slightly over his own narrow, Italian leather shoes. He tried to play it off as a sophisticated bow, but the camera caught that split second of genuine, uncoordinated panic. I leaned in, my old jacket brushing against his pristine suit, the scent of pine and motor oil clashing with his synthetic, expensive fragrance. He tilted his ear toward me, expecting a plea for mercy or perhaps a confused mumble about where the nearest exit was. I've lived long enough to know that some people only learn the depth of a hole when they are already halfway down it. My hearing aid decided that moment was perfect to start whistling like a tea kettle, reacting to the high-frequency speakers nearby. I tapped it twice with a rhythmic, steady beat that matched the pulse of my cold, quiet fury. "Lachlan," I whispered, my voice barely a thread, yet heavy as a mountain. "You just lost the investor who gave you every cent of your startup capital." His smirk didn't vanish instantly. It dissolved slowly, like sugar and acid, as my words finally pierced the thick layer of his ego. I looked past him to Vaughn, who was watching us with the sharp, narrowed eyes of a man who had just realized he was backing a fraud. Vaughn wasn't just a lead investor. He was the boy I had pulled out of a flooded basement 40 years ago, and he never forgot a debt. Lachlan's face went the color of unbaked bread, the realization hitting him that the withered hands he despised were the ones holding his leash. I stepped back, letting the silence expand and fill the room until the air felt thin for everyone but me. I saw Leona's reflection in the glass wall, her eyes burning with a fire that told me she was done playing the silent witness. The transition was complete. The hunter had become the prey, and he didn't even know how to run. I turned to my wife, seeing a look in her eyes that told me the real storm was only just beginning to break.
I watched the color drain from Lachlan's face, a shade of white that reminded me of the cheap primer he'd used on his first office walls. Cyrus stood there, calm as a lake at dawn, while our son-in-law looked like he had just swallowed a live bee. I adjusted my clutch, a tiny, gold chain thing Serafina had insisted I carry, which was barely large enough to hold a single peppermint, let alone my dignity. It's hard to look intimidating when you're struggling to fit a standard-sized tissue into a bag the size of a lemon, but I didn't need a weapon when I had the truth. My mother always said you can tell a man's character by how he treats those he thinks he no longer needs. Lachlan had spent the last hour treating us like old furniture destined for the curb, forgetting who provided the wood and the craftsmanship. I saw Serafina hovering at the edge of the circle, her mouth slightly open, finally catching the shift in the room's atmosphere. The cameras were still rolling, capturing the exact second the visionary of the year turned into a panicked schoolboy. I reached out and took a glass of that neon green punch from a passing server, nearly spilling it on my sensible heels because the glass had no stem. "Careful, Lachlan," I said, my voice smooth as aged brandy. "Your audience is waiting for the next brilliant insight, or perhaps just a graceful exit." He tried to speak, but only a dry, clicking sound came out of his throat. I've spent 40 years standing by Cyrus, watching him build worlds with his bare hands and a sharp mind. Lachlan made the mistake of thinking our silence was an invitation to walk all over us. He was about to find out that the foundation he was standing on was owned by the very people he had just spat upon. I looked toward Vaughn, the man who held the purse strings, and saw him start to walk toward us with a grim, knowing smile. Vaughn didn't even glance at the cameras or the hovering PR team as he walked straight past Lachlan to stand before us. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the faint, panicked breathing of our son-in-law. I saw Cyrus reach for a napkin, but the smart dispenser nearby misinterpreted his hand gesture and shot a stream of lavender-scented foam onto his sleeve. He stared at the dollop of suds with a dry, weary expression, as if he were watching a toddler try to do a man's job. "I suppose I'm meant to be impressed by a machine that sneezes on me," he whispered, wiping the foam onto a nearby silk curtain without breaking eye contact with Vaughn. It was the perfect metaphor for this evening: expensive, flashy, and utterly useless when things got messy. Vaughn didn't laugh. He just looked at the stain and then at the trembling man standing at the podium. "Lachlan, I think you should step away from the microphone," Vaughn said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth he'd shown earlier. He then turned his focus back to Cyrus, revealing the document he had been carrying in his inner pocket. "You were right. The audit found that the land titles were never officially transferred to the new corporation." Lachlan let out a sound like a punctured tire, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany podium until his knuckles were white. He had spent months bragging about asset liquidation, never realizing that the biggest asset, the land itself, was still locked in our family trust. It was a cold, hard fact that turned his modern empire into a temporary tent in a parking lot. I watched my daughter's face fall as the reality of her husband's incompetence finally shattered her reflection of him. The victory felt heavy, a burden of truth that was finally being laid at the feet of the person who tried to bury us. I saw Vaughn's hand tighten on the folder, and I knew the next words out of his mouth would be the ones that ended Lachlan's career forever. Lachlan looked like a man trying to catch smoke with his bare hands as Vaughn stepped closer to the podium. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting his unraveling to every stakeholder and competitor in the city. I saw Cyrus leaning over a small, futuristic bowl of deconstructed snacks, trying to figure out if the moss-covered spheres were meant to be eaten or were just expensive decorations. He picked one up, sniffed it suspiciously, and whispered, "Leona, I think I just tried to eat a piece of the building's insulation." Even in the middle of a financial execution, my husband's practical mind was searching for a decent piece of bread in a room full of foam. Serafina rushed over, her heels clicking like a frantic Morse code on the polished marble floor. "Dad, Mom, please, we can talk about the titles in private. Don't do this here," she pleaded, her voice trembling. I looked at her, not with anger, but with the steady disappointment of a mother who realized her child had traded her roots for tinsel. "We didn't do this, Serafina," I said, keeping my posture as straight as a shipyard crane. "Lachlan did this the moment he decided that the people who raised you are just obstacles in his path." Vaughn cleared his throat, a sound that silenced the room more effectively than any gavel could. He signaled to the lead cameraman to stop the stream, but the young man just froze, realizing he was capturing the biggest corporate collapse of the decade. Lachlan finally found his voice, but it was thin and high, a shadow of the roar he'd used earlier. "I'm the CEO. I'm the one they came to see." He yelled, but the word CEO sounded like a title on a cardboard crown. Cyrus put the insulation back in the bowl, his face turning cold as he stepped toward the light. Vaughn pulled a second folder from his bag, and the color didn't just leave Lachlan's face, it seemed to leave the entire room as the true depth of the debt was revealed. Lachlan's hands were shaking so hard the microphone began to pick up the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the plastic casing. He looked at us, his eyes darting like a trapped bird's, searching for a gap in the cage of his own making. I saw Cyrus trying to adjust the minimalist lighting panel on the wall behind us, accidentally triggering a strobe effect that turned the room into a silent disco for 3 confusing seconds. He stepped back, grumbling about how a simple light switch was apparently too low-tech for a building that couldn't even manage its own taxes. "I just wanted a bit of light to see the fine print, Leona," he muttered, finally giving up on the touch-sensitive glass and smoothing his jacket. Vaughn didn't wait for the lights to stabilize. He held the folder open for everyone in the front row to see the mounting red ink. The expansion you promised, Vaughn said, his voice dropping an octave, was funded by loans secured against property you don't even own. Lachlan turned to Serafina, begging for a defense, but she was looking at the floor, the weight of the lies finally sinking in. It's a tragic thing to see a man realize his throne is actually a folding chair on thin ice. I stood there, my hands folded over my tiny, useless purse, feeling the cold satisfaction of a person who has watched the truth catch up to a fast runner. There was no scream, no dramatic outburst, just the sound of a man's reputation evaporating in the air-conditioned breeze. Lachlan tried to step toward us, perhaps to beg, but the distance between his polished shoes and our old boots felt like a canyon. I noticed a stray thread on Cyrus's jacket and reached out to pluck it, a small act of order in a room full of chaos. We didn't need to say another word. The paper in Vaughn's hand was doing all the screaming for us. The security guards at the door shifted their weight, no longer looking at us as intruders, but as the only people in the room with real gravity. Lachlan's gaze finally met mine, and for the first time, he saw not a mother-in-law, but the woman who had audited every cent of this business for 20 years. He opened his mouth to offer a deal, but he didn't realize that the man he was trying to negotiate with had already signed the papers to shut him out. Lachlan reached for the edge of a floating glass table, his fingers slipping on the polished surface like he was grasping for a lifeline. He tried to offer a restructuring plan, but his voice cracked, sounding more like a desperate plea than a professional strategy. Cyrus, meanwhile, had sat down in a nearby high-tech swivel chair, but the weight sensor triggered a smart ergonomic adjustment that slowly began to recline him. He didn't panic. He simply leaned back with a sigh, looking at the ceiling as if he were contemplating the stars while the chair hummed beneath him. I've slept on flatter beds in the army, but usually, they didn't try to fold me like a lawn chair first, he remarked to the stunned, silent room. I ignored the distraction, keeping my eyes locked on Lachlan, whose world was shrinking to the size of the document in Vaughn's hand. The bank has already been notified, Lachlan, Vaughn stated, his voice as cold as the ice in the half-melted cocktails on the bar. I saw the moment reality finally hit him, the realization that his cars, his suits, and this very building were all just borrowed plumage. He looked at me, his eyes wet with a desperation that was far too late to be called genuine regret. "Mother, please, talk to him," he whispered, finally using a title he had treated with nothing but contempt only moments before. I felt a pang of sadness for my daughter, who was watching her idol crumble into a pile of debts and bad intentions. I remembered the day they married, and how Cyrus had warned me that a man who builds on pride alone always has a roof made of glass. I didn't move to help him, because some lessons can only be learned in the debris of a total, public failure. The silence in the room became so heavy that the only sound left was the hum of the cameras, still recording the death of a reputation. Lachlan lunged for the folder in Vaughn's hand, a last, pathetic attempt to destroy the evidence before the cameras could zoom in any closer. Lachlan's desperate lunge ended not with a grab, but with a clumsy stumble that sent him sprawling toward the base of the podium. He looked up, his face contorted with a mix of fear and a sudden, ugly realization that his theater of power had closed its doors forever. Behind me, Cyrus was still engaged in a quiet battle with his reclining chair, which had now decided to vibrate rhythmically as if trying to massage his back during the crisis. "If this thing tries to fold me into a suitcase, Leona, please tell them I lived with a straight spine," he whispered, his voice cutting through the tension with a dry, sharp wit. I didn't turn around because my gaze was fixed on our daughter, whose silent tears were the only thing in the room that actually hurt to watch. She was finally seeing the man she married, not a titan of industry, but a hollow shell who thought he could buy his way out of a lifetime of shortcuts. Vaughn pulled the folder back, his expression one of pure, professional disgust as he looked down at the man on the floor. The guests began to murmur, a low tide of judgment that grew louder as the visionary failed to even stand back up with grace. I reached into my bag and finally found that peppermint, the sharp taste of menthol grounding me while the world around Lachlan turned to ash. True power isn't in the suit you wear or the height of your office. It's in being the one who doesn't have to scramble when the lights go out. I saw the security team approach, their heavy boots making a sound that signaled the end of the party and the beginning of the consequences. Lachlan looked at me one last time, hoping for a flicker of the weak, old woman he had tried to belittle, but all he found was the iron will of the person who actually balanced the books. The cameras caught every humiliating second, the very technology he worshipped now serving as his digital executioner. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the evening finally begin to shift from our shoulders onto the person who deserved it. Cyrus finally managed to free his jacket from the chair, standing up with a deliberate, slow motion that made everyone in the room hold their breath. He walked toward the podium, not to help his son-in-law up, but to retrieve the one thing Lachlan had forgotten was truly priceless. Cyrus reached the podium, his steps heavy and intentional, like a clock ticking down the final seconds of a failed experiment. Lachlan cowered at his feet, but Cyrus didn't even look down. He was focused on the small, tarnished brass compass sitting on the edge of the speaker's stand. It was the same one my father had given him when we broke ground on the first warehouse, a tool for finding north when the world gets foggy. Lachlan had used it as a mere prop, a vintage touch for his brand, never understanding that a compass only works if you actually know where you're going. Cyrus picked it up, but his thumb accidentally grazed a hidden voice-activated button on the podium, causing a sudden burst of upbeat, celebratory confetti to rain down on the ruined man below. "Wrong button," Cyrus muttered, brushing a stray piece of gold foil off his sleeve with the same care he'd used to remove a wood shaving. He looked at the compass, then at me, and I saw 40 years of shared battles reflected in his steady, gray eyes. Vaughn stepped aside to let us pass, his silence a sign of profound respect for the ghosts who had finally reclaimed their house. Serafina reached out to touch my arm, and though I didn't pull away, I didn't stop either. Some paths have to be walked alone until you find your way back to the truth. We walked toward the exit, the cameras following us not as victims, but as the architects of a reality that Lachlan could never hope to inhabit. At the door, Cyrus paused to adjust his old jacket, struggling for a second with a zipper that had always been stubborn when it sensed a draft. "Some things are just built to last, Leona," he said, finally getting the teeth to line up with a satisfying, metallic click. We stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the glitter, the debt, and the noise behind us in that hollow glass tower. The city lights stretched out before us, vast and indifferent, but we walked with the quiet weight of people who finally own the ground beneath their feet. Behind us, the empire was falling, but as I felt Cyrus take my hand, I knew that everything we truly built was already safe at home.